Are you noticing your car insurance rate creep up even without tickets or claims? You're not alone. That's why there's Jerry, your proactive insurance assistant. Jerry handles the legwork by comparing quotes side by side from over 50 top insurers so you can confidently hit buy. No spam calls, no hidden fees. Jerry even tracks rates and alerts you when it's best to shop. Drivers who save with Jerry could save over $1,300 a year. Don't settle for higher rates. Download the Jerry app or visit jerry.ai/libsyn today. That's jerry.ai/libsyn.
This is episode 81 of That Shakespeare Life. This episode is brought to you in part by Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation App, the only audio Shakespeare pronunciation app, which is designed to remove fears about how to speak Shakespeare's language so that his plays are accessible to everyone. Find out more about this app in today's show notes and stay tuned after the episode for how you can learn more.
Hi, I'm Emma Smith. I'm a professor of Shakespeare Studies at the University of Oxford. A really great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
The figure that strikes the hour, strikes the bell, you can still see this in Venice, for example, or at Wells Cathedral, is like a little kind of soldier-style figure, and it was called a jaquemart. And he would wield a hammer and hit the clock on the hour.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
The Renaissance in England brought with it the exploration of new lands as well as the invention of new technology. For William Shakespeare, the concept of using something as ordinary as a wristwatch was a brand new thought that most people had never seen before. In fact, one of the ways we even know there were wristwatches in Shakespeare's lifetime at all comes from a single reference to a, quote, arm watch given to Elizabeth I by Robert Dudley. For the regular guy on the street, or in the theater in our case, they had a different idea of what it meant to tell time, as the 16th century marked the first time anyone was trying to do it using mechanical clocks. Our guest this week is Wendy Beth Hyman. She is an expert on not just how Elizabethans like William Shakespeare kept track of the hours during the day, but on the specific mechanisms of those clocks, like jaquemarts, which were part of these newly invented timekeeping devices being created during Shakespeare's lifetime. Today, Wendy is going to share with us a piece of history about timekeeping, as well as to let us in on what a jaquemart is by using references to what we find in Shakespeare's plays. It turns out that some of the words and phrases Shakespeare uses reveal something of what it was like to live in a time when the creation of something ordinary like a wristwatch was a completely revolutionary idea. Wendy Beth Hyman is Associate Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Oberlin College, where she teaches classes on Shakespeare, Renaissance poetry, and the intersections of early modern literature with science, material culture, and the history of art. She is author of Impossible Desire and the Limits of Knowledge in Renaissance Poetry, an essay collection called The Automation in English Renaissance Literature, and she's also the co-editor with Hilary Eklund of Teaching Social Justice Through Shakespeare, Why Renaissance Literature Matters Now. She has published widely on the relationship between early modern poetics and the history of science, including work on early modern mechanical birds, the relationship between physics and metaphysics in lyric, and the strong proximity between mechanical engines and the ingenious poetry. Her article on early modern clockworks and jaquemarts shows their influence on Jack Falstaff and other characters negotiating their relationship to time in Shakespeare's history plays. That's the topic that she has joined us to talk about today. She has served on the program committee of the Shakespeare Association of America, is one of the editors for the forthcoming Routledge Encyclopedia of the Renaissance World, and is co-editing a special issue of English Literary Renaissance called Theorizing Renaissance Fictions. Hello, Wendy. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Cassidy. How are you?
I'm doing good, and we're glad to have you here to share a piece of this history with us. In her article for Early Theater in 2013, Wendy calls attention to a theme of time in Shakespeare's As You Like It, specifically how it contrasts the way time is perceived at court versus how it's perceived in the forest. Wendy, what was the reputation of time in the forest environment?
Right. So, the funny thing is when we think about time in the forest, we are really thinking predominantly about a whole genre of thought, the pastoral, that is kind of built upon the fantasy of a removal from time. And if we think about how this plays out in Shakespeare, we see it in all sorts of places, right? In As You Like It, in The Winter's Tale, in Twelfth Night, in all of those comedies or romances built upon a comedic structure, there is a kind of fantasy of a removal from court time, a idealized prehistorical time, if you will. So I often think about it partly in the terms that were laid out by Berger's Second World and Green World, that a lot of Shakespeareans are going to be familiar with, that when you are in a comedy, you leave the court, you go to the country, and you return to the court transformed. It's like the modern road trip movie, but in the process, something magical happens because you are able to step away from the day-to-day, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. And I think that model, we see that in modern day, movies and theater as well, that there's this concept of you go away and find yourself, and then you come back with yeah.
Exactly. And in Shakespeare, there's this particularly kind of homosocial nature to that removal from time. It's like you're outside of the marriage economy, and it's sort of timed towards reproduction, if that makes sense. So it's in Winter's Tale, we hear Polixenes referring back to the boy eternal that he lived in with Leontes, where every day was kind of the same as every other day. And Celia and Rosalind talk that way. Helen and Hermia talk that way. It's both homosocial and it's also kind of prelapsarian, right? It's before the fall. It's something where humans got to exist before not just clock time, but even human time, if that makes sense.
Mechanical watches, as well as the famous arm watch, presumed to be a wristwatch that was given to Elizabeth I by Robert Dudley, were in existence during Shakespeare's lifetime. So why was time not considered portable? We're talking about them going away from the court to this place where time is not. Why were there places like a forest where a person could escape it? Why did it not travel with them?
Yeah, it's such an interesting conflict here because, of course, we see Touchstone talk about Jack pulling a dial from his poke, but he doesn't really tell us, and now it's 12:15, right? What he draws from that timepiece are philosophical thoughts. From hour to hour, we ripe and ripe. From hour to hour, we rot and rot. Or we get the 7 ages of man speech. So there's this appendage, this timepiece, but they're not telling time with it. And in fact, it may well have been a sundial rather than a mechanical clock that he's pulling from his pocket. So, some of this goes back to the history of timekeeping, which really is still in its infancy in Shakespeare's day. We have mechanical clocks in pretty much every city at this point, but the mechanical watch is not something that becomes available into the early 16th century in England, and it's still purely a luxury item. So few of us are Robert Dudley and Queen Elizabeth.
Yeah.
And yet, at the same time, there's this phenomenal degree of temporal consciousness. There's a curiosity and awareness of time, but portable time was not really something that people had. So it's an interesting question. On the one hand, everywhere was a place away from time because there were so few places you could really see the actual hour, forget the minute. And by the same token, it was really starting to colonize people's thinking about the day, the workday, their existence on Earth.
The advent of mechanical means of telling time in an automated fashion was new for Shakespeare's lifetime, with nigh unto constant innovation and experimentation going on around him, resulting in colloquial expressions and very unique cultural tidbits to be unearthed in the phrases Shakespeare uses in his plays. Wendy, why is one of these cultural expressions, the jack, considered revealing of Shakespeare's understanding about clocks?
Right. So, I don't know how much Shakespeare himself actually understood about clocks per se, and yet clocks are everywhere in Shakespeare. The mechanical details, not so much, but they're everywhere, even in the forests and the Roman republics where they don't belong. And there's also this kind of understanding of character, and this is the piece that I'm getting into in that article, where a jack as a person is kind of interpolated within systems of timekeeping in some way. So to talk about this, I kind of have to nerd out about etymology for a minute.
Oh, yes, of course. Please do.
But I think given the audience, I'm among friends. So the figure that strikes the hour, strikes the bell, you can still see this in Venice, for example, or at Wells Cathedral, is like a little kind of soldier-style figure. And it was called a jaquemart. And he would wield a hammer and hit the clock on the hour. They're really neat. They're little kind of tiny mechanical automatons. So if you think about the word jacquemart, it comes from, well, the name Jack and the French word for hammer, which is marteau. So a jaquemarteau, a jackhammer, is a guy wielding, a Joe Blow, if you will, wielding a hammer. And it comes from this very kind of classist view, right, of a working class character who does physical labor, right? And we still have this in the word jackhammer, or really all of the mechanical or iterative qualities of jacking, some of them not so polite. So there's this kind of sense that what it is to be a jack is to be a iterative, mechanical, somewhat edgy figure. And we see this in so many places that have been overlooked in Shakespeare. So in Richard II, in Richard III, in As You Like It, even in Shakespeare's sonnets, where he refers to saucy jacks that nimble leap to kiss. There's this idea that the jack is kind of a social climber, an upstart, a figure that is maybe getting above his station and interrupting. And we see this again in Richard III. Because like a jack, thou keeps stroke between thy begging and my meditation. Why are you kind of getting in the way and asking things you shouldn't, trying to get above your station?
In her article, Wendy notes comments by Touchtone in As You Like It, indicating carrying a clock was a sign of, quote, social sophistication. Wendy, does that mean that owning a watch or carrying one was a status symbol?
Right, absolutely. So mechanical watches were expensive imports and associated, like the name Jack, with social climbing in a sense. So if you think about Malvolio's fantasy in Twelfth Night, where several of my people with an obedient start will make away from Sir Toby, and I frown the while and perchance wind up my watch or play with my, funny pause there, some rich jewel. So he's fantasizing about being promoted and that promotion involving playing with a watch. So it was something that you would, if you had it at all, definitely associates you with kind of international sophistication and wealth. Definitely a status symbol.
Wendy suggests that while many clocks only measure the hour on the hour, one mechanical implement that she's referred to today is the Jacquemart, was able to measure quarter hours. Wendy, where would the average 16th century playgoer have observed this Jacquemart? And would they have been measuring these quarter hours as a rule, or was this kind of a specialty thing?
Right. So to think about this, we really have to think how even the hour was still so inexact. Mechanical timepieces existed, mechanical clocks existed, but amazingly enough, they themselves were corrected against sundials. So even the hour was really quite variable. So having a quarter hour, and in fact, jaquemarts were often called quarter boys or quarter jacks, measuring time in 15-minute increments was really quite a remarkable innovation. Now, people had minutes too eventually, but those, again, are quite variable. So a place to look for this, Tiffany Stern has written a wonderful recent article about Jacquemarts, clocks, timepieces, and she records that there were a couple of places in London where technically clocks rang the quarter hours, and one was actually St. Paul's. But that Jacquemart was inside a gallery, so most people wouldn't see it. And there was another at the Royal Exchange, built in about 1600. But I think that the place that most people would have seen one, if they'd seen it at all, would be at Wells Cathedral. Beautifully, that Jacquemart is still in existence. It was built in sometime between the late 1380s and early 1390s, and it is an astronomical clock that actually records a geocentric pre-Copernican universe. So the moon and Earth are at the center, and the sun revolves around it, which is pretty neat. So there was a place, within reasonable proximity of London where one could see a Jacquemart and kind of think about time on that scale. But I think it can't be overstated just how inexact and confusing time was for a lot of Elizabethans who couldn't really even have told you the year they were born. Can I add a little anecdote about that? It's kind of interesting.
Absolutely. Please share.
So think about that moment in Romeo and Juliet, where Juliet's mother asks the nurse how old her daughter is. It's very sad. And the way that the nurse tells her age is in relation to Lammastide, in relation to the year of the earthquake, which was the time that she was weaned, which was the day after she had this traumatic fall, and her husband made this marvelous joke, right? So it's very much kind of telling time in terms of major events rather than in, a specific year or month or day or anything like that.
Like they're not following a calendar.
Right.
Despite the apparent affluence the ownership of a clock conveyed, you've mentioned that these expressions related to the clock, like Jack in the Box, for example, that were used to indicate a lower class and the mechanical labor origin of the clock itself. Wendy, please put these things together for us. How does it match up that a clock was a sign of affluence and superiority, but creating the clock, and certainly the jack as a term for a jester or a clown, and even the clock itself as a mechanical device, was seen as something inferior or perhaps even subhuman?
Okay, so this is complicated. And of course, whenever we're talking about time, we're talking about both mechanical and philosophical topics, right? So just to kind of bring in one tiny other piece of etymology, I swear I won't do much. This name Jack also traces its roots to Yakov or Jacob, and that is a derivative that results in the name Iago. That is to say, there is this association with ambition and trickery and ingenuity that is associated with clock time. And so, in a sense, we are seeing both somebody who's ingenious, but maybe circumnavigating the appropriate and correct channels, if you will. So, in order for high status people to valorize and validate their position, anyone who's a climber is kind of denigrated as a jack, a mere mechanic, a working class person who has not inherited his rights or social station. So that is part of the process of kind of, as you say, making somebody inferior, subhuman, really on a class basis. And what Shakespeare's plays show is in fact, a celebration of characters like Jack Falstaff, and I think even to some extent the ingenuity of an Iago for being able to outwit and outmaneuver the social structures that would kind of keep them in their place and keep them from being in charge of time, the way that historical figures like Richard III or Henry IV, later Henry V, would be. At the same time, and this again is getting kind of philosophical and kind of etymological all at once, we might think about the weird conflation between things that we think of as really distinct. That is, the engine or the machine or the thing that's engineered, and the cerebral quality of being ingenious or brilliant. But really, we see this similarity between the engine and the ingenious. And we see a character like Hamlet say that when he's writing a poem to Ophelia, that he'll be true to her as long as this machine is to him. So, sorry.
I had the impression it was more of a literal connection for Shakespeare than it is for us today. But I think we colloquially make these connections that you're mentioning, the engine, the idea of your brain being the powerhouse of the body or whatever.
Right.
I think we still make those things, but for us, it's more artistic. And I think for the 16th century, they had a more literal association between these things.
No, I think that's right. Yeah.
I'm glad that you went into the etymology of Jacquemarts tracing to Jacob, tracing to Iago, because I actually had a listener ask about that very question. So you've sent their answer directly. So thank you for that.
Right. And I just want to agree with your last comment too, that I think for them it was more literal, or there was more of a conflation between the mechanical and the human. And we really see that not just in the Jacquemart, but in all automaton figures, in the sense of there being something wonderful and magical and lifelike about the machine. They did not really separate that from the human to the extent that we do.
Wendy points out in her article that the same people who made puppets were responsible for the craftsmanship of a Jacquemart. Wendy, does that mean that Jacquemarts would have been used in a theater where puppets might have appeared as well?
I wish. Probably not. I think that most of the Jacquemarts, and more broadly speaking, automatons in Renaissance literature, are metaphorical because they were just so expensive and so cumbersome. I mean, the move to Blackfriars did enable access to more sophisticated engineering, but we don't think that there were probably Jacquemarts in theatrical spaces. But there is kind of one. Again, this is really mostly metaphorical, but I don't know how it was conveyed. Robert Greene, the person who called Shakespeare an upstart crow, wrote a fabulous play called Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay. Are you familiar with this play?
I'm not familiar with the play, no.
So cool. It has a magician scientist figure who's trying to build an automaton out of a brass head. And he works on it for years. He falls asleep, and his assistant witnesses it speaking for the first time. And of course, the magician misses the whole thing. And anyway, it speaks 3 times, and it says, "Time is, time was, time is past." And then, according to the stage directions, a giant hand wielding a hammer smashes the talking brass head.
Wow, it's a Jacquemart.
Exactly.
How exciting. Well, I hold out hope that maybe some of the people who built these Jacquemarts were actually the people doing the set decorations. I like to think that overlapped somewhere.
It's definitely up there with Exit Pursued by a Bear for stage directions.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. With the use of terms like hammer, as well as other clock references that are employed specifically, like orological terminology that happens in Shakespeare's plays, when these happen on stage, would the audience have understood or caught on to what Shakespeare was doing here?
Right. So I think, like all questions about what Shakespeare's audience knew, because the audience was so heterogeneous, the answer
depends.
Has to be, which person in the audience. But I think that they would definitely have been more tuned in than we are to the associations around the name Jack. And there are lots of little jokes in the plays that suggest that awareness. There's a silly moment in Merry Wives of Windsor. I think it's Herndon the Hunter who says, "What is the clock, Jack? Ha ha! I'll be here all week." It's just this little, silly moment that I think is catching most audience members. And, it's probably worth mentioning that this is also the period in which the flush toilet is invented. and that was colloquially referred to as the jakes. So if anything, I think those associations are dimmer for us than they were for Shakespeare's audience. And they were probably, for the most part, fairly attuned to at least the stuff around names and time, because they were curious about it too.
A famous line from Shakespeare's Henry IV, Part 1 has Henry V declare it to be superfluous to demand the time of the day. That is my favorite quote from Shakespeare. And I wonder if this is just an instance of a frustrated man venting his anger, or was there actually a cultural reality for what timekeeping meant for Shakespeare being revealed there?
Right. So I think what is really being indicated here is this sense that Falstaff is idle. And he isn't really in need of precise time. In fact, that description seems to bring in a couple of different sorts of times, including the sundial, right? That hot wench and taffeta.
Yes.
Seems to be kind of a sunny figure. But anyway, I think the basic idea, and we see this in a lot of Shakespeare, is a sense that time is variable. So back to As You Like It, right? Time travels in diverse paces with diverse persons. I'll tell you who time ambles withal, who time trots withal, who time gallops withal, and who he stands still withal. So Hal is insulting Falstaff as being someone who doesn't really need time. Another kind of Robert Greene aside, in A Looking Glass for London and England, he says that the usurer's clock is the swiftest clock in the town, right? The person who's counting down the money he's going to make on time. So, and it makes sense that time was not just philosophically variable, but literally timepieces varied so much from person to person. So from Hal's perspective, and I think it's a fair charge against Falstaff, Falstaff doesn't really need to know the time. So this is something that he kind of claims to himself. But of course, the play really does immortalize Falstaff, doesn't it? I mean, he's the figure who has lasted for all time, in a sense. So maybe Hal doesn't really get the last word over that.
I don't think we can escape the discussion of mechanical clocks without mentioning the motley group of rude mechanicals in A Midsummer Stream. Shakespeare portrays them as easily dismissed puppets, which seems to me to be connected to this idea of a jaquemart, or at least a piece to a larger puzzle. Is Shakespeare using this situation to comment on how he thought writers did not get enough respect for their work?
Yes, I think so. And it points back wonderfully to the kind of guild history that is behind acting. So if you go back to, say, medieval English drama, the theater really emerges from the workers' guilds. Different, say, groups of carpenters would put on one mystery cycle, and the blacksmiths would put on another. And these were performed inside and eventually outside of the church. So this is why we have characters like Slug the Joiner or Bottom the Weaver in Midsummer Night's Dream. It's kind of a doffing of the hat to the origins of drama in physical labor. And I think we see that in the fact that even plays about fairies must erect walls and cart props and haul buckets, and someone's got to hold up a lantern. There's this awareness that what it is to make poetry or to create an enchanted play is also to do work, right? And if you think about that central scene in the play where the fairy queen Titania falls in love with Bottom, it's this majestic wish fulfillment fantasy, isn't it? Of the character who most emblematizes the actor, making the fairy queen, Queen Elizabeth, fall in love with him. So this idea of the rude mechanicals as kind of denigrated by a figure like Duke Theseus, I don't think the play valorizes his position. I think we are supposed to see the work, the physical work that goes into creating a play that so enthralls its audiences.
I saw an episode of a British TV show called Rosemary and Thyme, and in it, Laura Thyme is an ex-police officer, and she started talking about how they had this guild where they had it was a drama group for police officers. And I watched it thinking that was so bizarre. I was like, why would the police officers have their own drama group? But if you look at the history of theater, this makes sense. And it's neat to think that this has carried over into modern times, that there are guilds like police officers who have drama troops. That's exciting.
Well, it makes sense because if you work with people all the time, then you have the connections already and the time. I mean, you meet after work for an hour and rehearse a play. I mean, it just kind of makes sense logistically, right?
It does make sense. And I know we would love to explore this topic further, to look into the history of Jacquemarts. What are some of your favorite books or resources that you can recommend that we can use to learn more?
Oh my gosh, there's not nearly enough written about these interesting characters. And when I wrote my own article on it, I had to go back to some pretty old stuff. So if you want, just where were these Jacquemarts and what were the details of the mechanical clocks, you kind of have to go back to people like William Starmer's Clock Jacks of England article from 1918. And unfortunately, Tiffany Stern, as I mentioned earlier, has written a much more recent version, and I'd highly recommend, called Time for Shakespeare, Hourglasses, Sundials, Clocks, and the Early Modern Theater. It's very helpful. A couple of other places to go would be a book called Shakespeare and Technology by Adam Max Cohen that has a chapter on clocks. And then a couple of other places that do a little more intellectual history around clock time would be Ricardo Quinones' The Renaissance Discovery of Time, and David Landis's Revolution in Time Clocks and the Making of the Modern World. And maybe I'll just mention one more. There's a fabulous book by Jessica Riskin called The Restless Clock that's very much about how, I guess the subtitle is A History of the Century-Long Argument over what makes living things tick. And that kind of explores the metaphor, the theme of the clock and its relationship to personhood throughout the early modern period.
And of course, you can read Wendy's article on Jacquemarts as well, and we will link to her article and these other publications that she's mentioned in the show notes for today's episode. Wendy, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Well, I think my first answer is that I would take Shakespeare's other Bible, which is Ovid's Metamorphoses. That is a collection of 250 or so myths that Ovid, who's contemporaneous actually with Jesus, gathered together from Greek and Roman myth, and they're all organized around the theme of transformation or metamorphosis. For example, the Pyramus and Thisbe story that's the rude mechanicals perform in Midsummer Night's Dream comes from Ovid's Metamorphoses, and it's also the foundation, actually, of Romeo and Juliet. So a good Shakespearean would need Ovid as well as the Bible. And
excellent choice. To be well set up there. Yes. Now, you said your first answer. Did you mean that was your primary choice, or that you had a second?
Well, that's the choice that I would take as a literature lover. And I think this is my cheaty answer. I'd probably also take an illustrated encyclopedia if I could be on a desert island.
If you have to be on a desert island, I think that's a good choice for sure. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I hope that you will forgive me for mentioning something that is not exactly next first, because it just came out.
Well, I did say what you're excited about. So,
well, I'm really excited that my monograph, Impossible Desire and the Limits of Knowledge in Renaissance Poetry, just came out in July. And that is a book about carpe diem seduction poetry, actually also very much about time. Because
congratulations.
Yeah, thanks. Carpe diem is the mode that says, seize the day before you die. So it's a study of that. And then in October, I have an edited collection coming out called Teaching Social Justice Through Shakespeare, Why Renaissance Literature Matters Now. So I'm pretty excited about that. And I guess I'll mention one other thing. I'm one of the editors for a forthcoming encyclopedia of the Renaissance world, and I'm commissioning entries related to knowledge in the Renaissance. And that's been a really fun project to work on, speaking of encyclopedias.
That all sounds very exciting. Wendy, I am so glad that you were here with us today to discuss this, and we will look forward to keeping up with you and all the exciting things that you are working on. I appreciate your time today. This has been an exciting conversation.
Oh, it's been a delight to speak with you. Thank you so much, Cassidy.
To add your voice to this conversation about Jacquemarts, as well as to see links to the wonderful resources Wendy mentions today, be sure to check out this episode's show notes. Not only will you find a place to leave your comments, but there's extra history and links to the resources for when you want to explore deeper into the history of today's topic. Find all these things and more at CassidyCash.com/episode 81. That's CassidyCash.com/EP81. When I first started studying Shakespeare, especially as an American, where the English language is very different on this side of the pond than where Shakespeare was writing, I often mispronounced some of the words that you find in the plays. Like originally I said Gloucester instead of Gloucester. Well, that's why I downloaded Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation app. It's an easy-to-use, straightforward app that you can download to your phone or tablet on iTunes as well as Google Play. And it lets you search any word from Shakespeare, and then it tells you exactly how to say it with a playable audio guide built right in. Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation app is like having a professional voice coach that you can carry in your pocket. Explore all the features of this app and download it right now at CassidyCash.com/Shakespeare app. That's CassidyCash.com/Shakespeare app. That's it for this week. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.